Hi everybody, welcome to another Storytime with Sid. It is me, Sidney of Hightower, forever and always, just coming at you again with another story. Now, this one's cool, and it's going to be a little bit shorter today, but I think it's fine because I think it's a really interesting story, and I'm excited to share it with you guys. So, without further ado, because you all know me enough by now, let's get to this week's story. And this week's story is called The Red Shoes. There was a little girl who was so delicate and charming, but in the summer she always had to go barefoot because she was poor. In the winter she wore big wooden clogs that made her little ankles turn quite red, and that was awful. In the middle of the village lived old Mother Shoemaker. She sat and sewed as best she could, using old strips of red cloth to make a little pair of shoes. Quite clumsy they were, but well intended, and the little girl was to have them. The little girl's name was Karen. On the very day that her mother was buried, Karen was given the red shoes, and she wore them for the first time. Now it's true that they weren't the proper shoes for mourning, but she didn't have any others, so she wore them on her bare feet, walking behind the humble coffin made of straw. All at once, a grand old carriage appeared, and inside sat a grand old woman. She looked at the little girl and felt sorry for her. Then she said to the pastor, "Listen here, give me that little girl, and I will be kind to her." Karen thought she said this because of her red shoes, but the old woman said they were awful, and they were burned. While Karen was dressed so nice in clean clothes, she had to learn to read and sew. The people said that she was charming, but the mirror said, "You are much more than charming. You're lovely." Then the queen happened to travel through the land, and she brought along her little daughter, who was a princess. People came flocking to the palace, and Karen was there too. The little princess stood in the window for all to see, dressed in fine white clothes. She wore neither a train nor a golden crown, but she had lovely red kid-skin shoes. Of course, they were much prettier than the ones that Mother Shoemaker had sewn for little Karen, but nothing in the world could compare with red shoes. Then Karen was old enough to be confirmed. She was given new clothes, and she was also to have new shoes. The rich shoemaker in town measured her little foot. This was at home in his new parlor, where a big glass cupboard stood filled with elegant shoes and shiny boots. Everything looked charming, but the old woman didn't see well, so it gave her no pleasure. In the midst of the shoes stood a pair of red ones, just like the one the princess had worn. How beautiful they were! The shoemaker said they had been sewn for a child of a count, but they didn't fit properly. "They must be made of the finest leather," said the old woman. "How they shine!" "Yes, how they shine," said Karen. "And they fit," so they were bought. But the old woman didn't know that they were red, because she would never have allowed Karen to be confirmed wearing red shoes, and yet she did. Everyone looked at her feet. When she walked up the church aisle toward the chancel doorway, she thought even the old paintings on crypts, those portraits of pastors and their wives wearing stiff collars and long black gowns, had fixed their eyes on her red shoes. And that was all she could think of when the pastor placed his hand on her, and as he spoke the holy baptism of the pact with God, and the fact that she should now be a good Christian. The organ played so solemnly, and the children sang so beautifully, and the old cantor song too. But Karen thought only of her red shoes. By that afternoon, the old woman had heard from everyone that the shoes were red, and she said how dreadful that was. It wasn't the least bit proper. From that day on, whenever Karen went to church, she would always wear black shoes, even if they were old. The following Sunday was her first communion, and Karen looked at the black shoes, she looked at the red ones, and then she looked at the red ones again, and put them on. It was lovely summer weather. Karen and the old woman walked along the path through the grain fields, where it was rather dusty. At the church door stood an old soldier with a crutch and a long, odd-looking beard that was more red than white. In fact, it was red. He bowed all the way to the ground and asked the old woman whether he might wipe off her shoes. Karen stretched out her little foot too. "Oh, look, what lovely dancing shoes," said the soldier. "Stay on tight when you dance." Then he slapped his hand on the soles. The old woman gave the soldier a little skilling that went with Karen into the church. Everyone inside looked at Karen's red shoes. All the paintings looked at them too. And when Karen knelt before the altar and put the golden chalice to her lips, she thought only of her red shoes. They seemed to be swimming around in the chalice before her, and she forgot to sing the hymn, and she forgot to say the Lord's Prayer. Then everyone left church, and the old woman climbed into her carriage. As Karen lifted her foot to climb in after her, the old soldier who was standing close by said, "Oh, look! What lovely dancing shoes!" And Karen couldn't help herself. She had to take a few dance steps. As soon as she started, her feet kept on dancing. It was as if the shoes had taken control. She danced around the corner of the church, and she couldn't stop herself. The coachman had to run after her and grab her and lift her into the carriage, but her feet kept on dancing, and she kicked hard at the old woman. Finally, they managed to take off her shoes, and her feet stopped moving. At home, the shoes were put in a cupboard, but Karen couldn't help but look at them. Then the old woman fell ill, and they said that she wouldn't live long. She needed someone to nurse and tend to her. And who shall do it but Karen? But over in town there was to be a great ball, and Karen was invited. She looked at the old woman, who didn't have long to live, after all. She looked at the red shoes. She didn't think there was any sin in that. She put on the red shoes. Why shouldn't she? And then she went to the ball and began to dance. But when she wanted to turn right, the shoes danced to the left. And when she wanted to move up the floor, the shoes danced down the floor, down to the stairs, along the street, and out the town gate. Dance she did, and dance she must, right out into the dark forest. Then she saw a little light overhead among the trees, and she thought it must be the moon, because it had a face. But it was the old soldier with the red beard. He sat there nodding and said, "What lovely dancing shoes!" Oh, what lovely dancing shoes. Then Karen was horrified and tried to take off the red shoes, but they wouldn't come off. She tore off her stockings, but the shoes had grown onto her feet. Dance she did, dance she must, over the field and the meadow, in the rain and in sunshine, night and day, but nighttime was the most terrible of all. She danced into the open churchyard, but the dead weren't dancing. They had better things to do than to dance. She wanted to sit down on the pauper's grave where the bitter tansy grew, but for her there was no peace or rest. And when she danced toward the open church door, she saw an angel there with long white robes, with wings that reached out from his shoulders to the ground. His face was stern and solemn, and in his hand he held a sword, gleaming and wide. "Dance you shall," he said. "Dance in your red shoes until you turn pale and cold, until your skin shrivels up like a mummy's. Dance from door to door, and wherever proud and vain children live, you will knock so they hear and fear you. Dance you shall, dance." "Have mercy!" cried Karen. But she didn't hear what the angel replied, because her shoes carried her through the gate out to the field, across the road, and along the path, and always she had to keep dancing. Early one morning she danced past a door she knew quite well. Inside a hymn could be heard, and they carried out a coffin that was adorned with white flowers. Then she knew that the old woman was dead, and she felt as if she had now been forsaken by everyone and then cursed by the angel of God. Dance she did, and dance she must, dance into the dark night. Her shoes carried her over thickets and stumps. Her feet were worn bloody. She danced across the heath to a lonely little house. She knew that was where the executioner lived. She tapped her finger on the window in pain and said, come out! I can't come inside because I'm dancing!" The executioner said, "Don't you know who I am? I chop off the heads of evil people, and I can feel my axes trembling." "Don't chop off my head," said Karen, "because then I won't be able to repent my sin, but chop off my feet with the red shoes." Then she confessed to her sin, and the executioner chopped her feet with the red shoes. But the shoes kept dancing with the little feet across the fields and into the deep forest. And he carved wooden feet and crutches for her, taught her a hymn that sinners always sing, and she kissed the hand that had wielded the axe and set out across the heath. "Now I've suffered enough for those red shoes," she said. "Now I'm going to church so they can see me." And she walked as fast as she could towards the church door, but when she got there, the red shoes were dancing in front of her. She was horrified and turned away. All week long she was sad and wept many bitter tears, but when Sunday came she said, "All right, Now I've suffered enough and struggled enough. I should think that I'm just as good as many of those people sitting proudly inside the church." Then she set off quite boldly, but she got no farther than to the gate when she saw the red shoes dancing in front of her. She was horrified and turned away, repenting her sin with all her heart. She went over to the parsonage and asked if she might be taken into service there. She would work hard and do everything she could. She'd no wish for wages. All she asked was for a roof over her head and permission to stay with good people. The pastor's wife felt sorry for her and gave her a position, and she was hardworking and thoughtful. Quietly she would sit and listen when the pastor read aloud from the Bible in the evening. All the children were very fond of her. Whenever they spoke of adornments and the finery and being as lovely as a queen, she would shake her head. The next Sunday they all went to church, and they asked if she would like to come along. But with tears in her eyes she looked sadly at her crutches. Then the others went to hear God's word while she sat alone in her tiny room. It was only big enough for a bed and a chair. There she sat with her hymn book, and she began reading with a pious heart. The wind carried the tones of the organ from the church to her. She raised her tear-stained face and said, "Oh, help me, God." Then the sun shone so bright, and right in front of her stood the angel of God in the white robes, the one she had seen that night at the church door. He was no longer holding a sharp sword, but a lovely green bow that was covered with roses. He touched it to the ceiling, which raised up high, and the spot he had touched shone a golden star. He touched the walls, and they moved outward. She saw the organ that was playing. She saw the old paintings of the pastors and their wives. The congregation was sitting in the carved pews and singing from their hymnals. The church itself had come home to the poor girl in the tiny cramped room. Or perhaps she had gone to the church. She was sitting in a pew with the others from the parsonage. When they finished the hymn and looked up, they nodded and said, "It was right for you to come, Karen." "It was God's mercy," she said. The organ soared, and the children's voices in the choir sounded gentle and lovely. The bright warm sunshine streamed through the window, reaching the church pew where Karen sat. Her heart was so filled with sunlight, with peace and joy, that it burst. Her soul flew on the sunlight to God, and no one asked about the red shoes. And that was The Red Shoes. Now, it's become quite clear to me that some of the fairy tales from this book are very focused on the Christian religion, which is a human religion that worships a deity called God. Now, these stories that have to do with this religion are very beautiful and have very interesting, good morals, so I don't mind reading them. But I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that Christianity is only one of the many religions celebrated by the human people, and that there are so many others that are very exciting and very interesting to read. And I would love to one day delve into stories and fairy tales that happen from those points of view as well. So one day I think I'd love to definitely explore those. So thank you for joining me for another Storytime with Sid. It's me, Sidney of Hightower, and I hope that you are staying happy, healthy, and safe. Everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for joining me.